Good morning, everyone. It's Pastor Jeremiah here, and welcome to our online service this morning. Thanks so much for being with us. We have been in, for the last couple of weeks, we've been in a series we're calling Faith Stories, and we had the opportunity, of course, a couple of weeks ago to interview Osborne Obayo, who's the World Comp CEO on the Kenya side. And then last week, Richard gave a message just about sharing your faith. And this week, we get the opportunity to hear more from Richard about his personal story, about his faith story. And I'm super excited to be able to get into this with him this morning. So thanks so much for tuning in. I do want to draw your attention to the website, also the church app. If you have a desire to connect with the church and anything that's going on, we have a number of events planned through this holiday season, of course, culminating in our Christmas Eve service. And so please check those things out. Well, I want to get into it this morning with Richard. Of course, I know his story, many parts of it. Always, it seems like year after year, there's little bits and pieces that you're leaking out that we've never heard before. So maybe we'll uncover one of those gems here this morning. But I wanted to start just with your home life growing up and just what that experience was like for you growing up. I know it wasn't ideal. You had parents that I think loved you in their own way, but there was a lot of things that I think were a struggle for you and your siblings growing up. So maybe just describe that experience for us.
Well, on the spiritual side, my mother was at one time in her life, she was a very strong Christian and loved the Lord before she met my dad. My dad was a Catholic, not really a practicing Catholic, and so he really had an animosity toward the faith in the first place. But all of us, my dad was kind of an angry man, and so all of us, were, and there was no affection in our home. Nobody ever said "I love you." Nobody ever. We weren't a huggy family, and so all of us kids, the five of us, were starved for affection, and so that kind of dictated the direction of our life in a lot of ways. And a lot of us were just desperate for friends. We tried too hard, and of course that has the opposite effect. But my dad and mom stayed together all their life. We never went through divorce. There was a lot of drama in the household as we got older because all of us were lost in our own way and went different directions. A lot of anger in the family. I personally was more of a peacekeeper. My brother was the angry one. But so we all had a role to play in the little delicate mobile that is family life. And so that's kind of the environment that we were raised in.
Yeah. And I know from your story that you had an encounter with Jesus first when you were relatively young, you and your sister. And so maybe get into that. Like, how did you first get exposure? I know your mom was a person of faith, so I'm sure that leaked out some ways, but what was that dynamic like, and then what was your first real encounter with church life and Jesus Christ and a relationship with Jesus?
Occasionally we had discussions with my mom about the faith, but all of us were pretty ignorant of anything to do with the faith. My grandmother was a very strong Christian, a very judgmental but very strong Christian. And so at one point, when I was 12 years old and my sister was 14, my grandmother paid for us to go to a Christian camp in Camp Crestview in Oregon.
So even though she was maybe legalistic and a little overbearing, she was the one that really financed this opportunity for you to experience Christ. So that's kind of a cool story.
She did. She financed, and we went down there, and my sister and I both had a powerful encounter with the Lord Jesus Christ. And so, I can clearly remember it to this day, even though I was only 12 years old.
And this is like a church day camp, like a week-long kind of a thing? Or?
Yeah, it's not a day camp. This was a week-long.
Oh, it was a full camp.
Yeah, full camp. And so we stayed there. And I can just remember it like yesterday, being in this meeting and responding to the altar call and going forward, and just really had a tremendous encounter with the Lord. I just felt loved for the first time in my life. And so I came to the Lord. The next day we were baptized, and I came out of the water speaking in tongues. I didn't know what I was doing. I had no idea what that was.
So you'd never heard of it before?
Never heard of it before.
Had this experience.
And but my home life was not conducive. There was no support. My sister and I decided to go to this church.
Where was this, by the way? West Seattle?
West Seattle.
Okay.
Yeah, we decided to go to this church because we were looking for some spiritual nourishment. But the church that we chose was really messed up.
Yeah.
I mean, it was, I won't tell you all the details, but it was really messed up in a lot of ways.
It was a charismatic church. It was a Foursquare church or something like that?
Foursquare church, yeah. Pentecostal church.
Yeah, so there's a lot of, Pentecostal churches back then, there was this great movement going on, which was wonderful, experiences like what Richard just described, but there was a lot of dysfunction in those environments as well.
Yeah, well, it wasn't just dysfunctional religion. There was a lot of bad things going on between the congregation and the pastor. The youth pastor had these huge problems, and we lasted about 2 years in that environment, and before my sister and I bailed out. And not only did we bail out of church, we just kind of bailed out of our faith.
How old are you at this point?
Now I'm 14 by the time we bailed out.
Okay.
And,
yeah.
And so that kind of left a sour taste in my mouth as far as going to church was concerned. Mm-hmm. And but I did have this encounter with Jesus, and I did, unbeknownst to me at that time, I really did have some understanding of what the voice of Jesus mm-hmm. sounded like, or what an encounter with Jesus felt like. Mm-hmm. So.
I know Osborne was talking about, I think he called it the dark years or something like that, and you had your own version of that lasted a lot longer than his did. I think he said his was from 16 to 18, but you're 14 at this point. You start to, from what I remember, you start to kind of struggle socially in high school, didn't really find your people, your place, and led to a lot of dysfunctional behaviors.
I was very shy, very inward, and isolated, often alone. But I was always desperately trying to get in, to be a part of the crowd. And by the time we started smoking, all of us, when we were just like 13 years old, every kid in our family, and so that was going all the time. But by the time I got to be later in high school, we started drinking. All the kids at Auburn High School were drinking. And then when I graduated from high school, I immediately got into drugs and just weekend stuff.
How did that start? I'm always curious because, I think, especially like marijuana smoking kind of skipped a generation. Your generation was big into it. Ours was my generation was the say no to drugs generation. Now it's legalized and it's kind of back in the main. So, did it start with marijuana? Was it? It
started with marijuana. It actually started with alcohol, and then drugs kind of saved me from alcohol. And for me, it was like I liked the person that I was when I was high.
Sure.
I just broke out of my box, my inhibitions. I was kind of reckless when I was high, and so I went down that path from the time I was 17 to the time I was 24.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, was there any progression into harder drugs, or was it mostly just marijuana at that point in time? Or
well, there was a progression into the drug community. I was always a person that did, uppers, not downers. I never injected myself with heroin, but my friends did, and so we were in that culture all the time. So there was this free flow of drugs, and later on, I got into the drug community, which is a horrible world.
Yeah.
Terrible things were happening all the time in the drug community.
So, at some point here at 18, you graduated from high school.
Yeah.
And what are you doing with your life? Like, what's the trajectory? What's the plan?
Well, I immediately went to work. I was always a hard worker, and so at 18 years old, I was running a roofing crew. Mm-hmm. It started when I was 17 in Federal Way, Washington. And so I was a hard worker, but we were also hard drinkers at that time too. So that was quite the life. And so my course was just hard work, any kind of hard work. I never went to college. So I was not on a career path per se. I was just on let's get the best job we can and make the most money we can.
Sure.
Yeah.
Is that what brought you to Alaska? Because I know that move happened.
Well, I had a relationship with a girl that I really loved, but she didn't really love me, and so that was a heartbreaking experience for me. Brought me into a kind of a deep depression, and so my trip to Alaska was kind of launched off the heels of that, and I was visiting my friends who were all drug users, and they all wanted to go to Alaska, and I had a car, and so it was kind of like a wild and crazy, okay, let's go to Alaska. So we just
moved to
took
Alaska.
Off. Yeah, well, we just took off for Alaska.
And you're, what, 22 at this point? Or?
Yeah, I'm 23 at this point,
23.
And so we're off to Alaska. And Alaska, we just, we lived in a hippie commune with a bunch of people out on the ridge outside of Fairbanks, and of course the winters were very bitter and cold in Alaska.
Yeah,
so
minus 40 degrees.
minus 40 degrees, yeah, really bad. So we all had to find some sort of accommodation during the winter, and I moved in with a bunch of people in Fairbanks, and several of them were hardcore drug dealers. And my story kind of progresses because there was a undercover state trooper that joined our drug community.
So at this point, how are you making money? Are you still working? Are you dealing drugs?
No, I was still working, but it was the middle of winter, and work was scarce, and so at that time I was unemployed, but living in this house with a whole bunch of people, and then these drug dealers all went south for the winter, leaving a big cache of drugs in the house, and so I was selling their drugs.
Okay, so
here and there.
You are a drug dealer.
Here and there, yes. I had become a drug dealer during this deal. And the story goes that there was this state trooper who joined our community, infiltrated our drug community, collected a lot of information, came to my house one night to buy a bunch of LSD. And so he came in, I sold him a bunch of LSD, and as soon as he walked out the door, he called his friends who were waiting outside, and all these state troopers came in the house and busted us all for drug dealing. And of course, by the time we got down to in a single night, they arrested over 100 people. So wow. It was a big sting operation. And so then I ended up in the Alaska State Prison I was there for a year. But it was during that time that the Lord began to speak to me. Unbeknownst to me, when my aunt, who went to St. Luke's Episcopal Church, heard that I had been arrested, she began to pray for me every single day. And then every week she brought my name to her home group, and I had no idea that this was happening, but it was having an effect on me. But I couldn't understand what the effect was. I felt like I was having a nervous breakdown. I'd always been a really together guy, but I'm sitting in jail, and I didn't recognize the conviction of the Holy Spirit. And so I'm having all these thoughts, about who I am and how I got here, and I'm writing things in my journal about what was going on inside of me, not really realizing that it was the Lord that was tampering with me.
But you were definitely having a crisis moment. You've got all this time to yourself. You're introspective. You're going through all these thoughts, and it's at that point that God really broke through in your life. And I know you've described that experience a number of times, but why don't you just describe it?
Well, I was a hardcore loner, really, and I was in this cell block with 28 other guys, and the TV was on all the time, and there was all this stuff going on, and so I really, I was kind of not a normal person at the time, but I really wanted to be alone. And so down in the dining hall during one of our lunches, I picked up one of our meatballs and threw it at a guard. And which is absolutely no. In order to get myself thrown into solitary confinement. It was on purpose.
I don't think I heard that before. So.
Yeah, and so they dragged me out of there and put me in solitary confinement. I'm laying in solitary confinement, just contemplating my navel and who I am, and I'm there half asleep on a single night. I heard an audible voice in my head, and it said, "I am the Lord. What are you going to do about that?" And as I said in my message last week, I knew it was Jesus. I can't tell you how I knew, but I knew it was Jesus. Meaning, it wasn't just a voice or I knew it was Jesus.
Well, this is the importance, I think, of that early encounter that you had with
Right.
Jesus. You could put a name on it. You understood who Jesus was, even in the dysfunction of the church environment. I think you probably recognized it because of that first experience you had.
I did. I knew it was Jesus, but I didn't know what I was going to do about that. Because the Christians in my family, I did not like any of them. They were judgmental type people, legalistic. I didn't want to be one of those.
That's interesting. So, that was the deterrent for you, is like, what does a Christian mean? What does a follower of Jesus mean? Because everything you had seen modeled for you was dysfunctional.
Yeah, not only that, becoming a Christian meant, that I was going to have to change my way of living.
Sure.
And so I had to contemplate this, and the question, I am the Lord, what are you going to do about that, hung with me for a couple of weeks. And I finally, after a week, I got out of solitary confinement. They would put me back in the population, and I was pondering, this thing all the time. I am the Lord, what are you going to do about that? And so I really had to think this through. And on the way to lunch one day, I'm walking down the hallway, and on an impulse, after 2 weeks, on an impulse, I just turned into this empty room, just fell down on my knees, and just broke like a watermelon hitting the pavement. And I just began to cry for the first time in about 10 years. I hadn't cried. For me, crying was weakness, and so I began to cry, poured out my heart to the Lord, and asked Him to take control of my life. And it was an incredible moment for me. And so I gave my life to Jesus. I didn't know much about the Bible at that point, but I gave my life to Jesus. And the next day I woke up, I was a different person. I felt different. Everything about me was different. I was just a different person. And for me, accepting Jesus was like being shot out of a cannon. I wasn't one of those, that kind of had the gradual awakening, and then I decided, well, I'll go to church, blah, blah, blah. It was a radical, life-changing experience for me.
But you're in prison, and so
Yes.
it's like, what do? You can't really join a church, but, you started a Bible study, right? And that was...
Started a Bible study with a group of guys. We started going to the chapel, which none of us had ever done before, and we started learning the Bible together. And I even started teaching the Bible. This woman had come in the prison with a Bible for him. She gave me a Bible, a Thompson Chain Reference Bible. And so I used to go to the back of the Bible to the references, and then we would go through those verses and make a few comments, and that's really where I started. It's public speaking. Every week I prepared something on a certain topic for the guys that we were meeting with, and we began to share. And then even too, I actually prayed. I asked the Lord, because I had a little bit of guitar experience, and just enough to play a few chords, but there were no guitars in the prison. Guitar strings are lethal weapons, and so.
Right.
But at that point, after I prayed, lo and behold, this guitar appeared in the chapel, and it was always in the chapel, and I began to play some choruses and play some songs. Songs, by the way, that I knew from the time I was 12 years old.
Sure.
And used to go to church, and it was the old hymns, that we started playing in church. And so was my first experience leading worship. So for the next 8 months, I'm in prison. It was like being in a monastery for me.
Yeah.
Total change of. And I remember the first time I ever gave a testimony, which was interesting, because I I hadn't said anything to anybody. I had this encounter with Jesus, totally changed my internal life, but I hadn't said anything to anybody until 10 days later. I'm walking down the hallway, and I said to some guy, I can't remember his name, a big burly guy, I said, hey, Jesus loves you. That was my first, saying something about Jesus to anybody. And he just shook his head hey, screw you, man, and then the next day I'm walking down the same hallway right next to the place where this guy is housed, and he reaches out through the bars, grabs me by the shirt, pulled my face right into the bars, boom, like this. And he says, hey, punk, Jesus loves you. And he pushes me away. And rather than that being a negative experience, I just was suddenly filled with delight.
Hey, he remembered.
That's the thing. It's hey, this guy remembered what this is hanging with him.
Yeah.
And so that was a big encouragement for me to begin to speak up. And it was all the safe places. I began to speak up with guys that were not violent, tell them my story. And that's how the prison fellowship began. And we led a lot of guys to the Lord, maybe 25 in
prison.
Yeah, in the next 8 or 9 months. And so that was...
So you're kind of discipling yourself, though, at this point. I mean, you got your Bible.
I read through the Bible 3 times.
Yeah.
In 7 months. So, and was studying the Bible from the Thompson Chain Reference. There were people that were coming into prison, but most of the ones that came in there were not substantive people. They really had very little to say. They all had the one story, about coming to Jesus, his salvation story.
Sure.
And Jesus loves you. He died for you. But as far as I
you hear messages about the thief on the cross 100 times.
Yeah, right.
So I mean, you get out of prison, or you have this opportunity, and I don't know if there's anything more about that season of life you want to talk about, but I know one thing that was on your mind, in testifying was, hey, I'm going to go to all my old friends, and I'm going to share Jesus with them and save a bunch of drug dealers.
It was kind of miraculous how I got out of prison, because I was sentenced to 6 years in jail. I only did 1. And my very first, I had a parole hearing after 11 months, and they invited me in for this parole hearing. And really, at that time, I wasn't that eager to get out of jail, believe it or not. I didn't really want to go back to my former life. And so I went in there to this parole meeting, and I just gave them my full-blown testimony. Hey, I've accepted Jesus. He's in my life. I was very enthusiastic. I just gave him my full testimony. And then a week later, I get this notice, okay, you're out. And so that was big news. And so I decided, I was going to get out very shortly. And so I decided, hey, I'm going to go back into Fairbanks. I'm going to find my friends, and I'm going to give them my testimony, tell them what's happened to me. And that was and so I get out of prison. At this point, I own 1 change of clothes and a Bible. That's everything, because the house that I had lived in Fairbanks had been burned down, we think, by the state police. So I lost everything in there. So anyway, I get out, I go to Fairbanks, to a house that I know where some of these guys live. I knock on the door, and I'm going to go in there. I'm going to share with them, hey, guys, I just want you to know what's happened to me. That was my plan. But I open the door, and they're having this big party. And without even thinking about it, I mean, it was like...
Richard's home, they hand you a beer.
It was like an out-of-body experience for me. Without even thinking about it, I start drinking, and I just take drugs, and I say nothing. And I was there for 2 days, just out of my mind. It's like, what am I doing? I'm having this internal conflict. And after 2 days, it's like 5 in the morning. I got to catch an airplane at 8 in the morning. And so I'm sitting there alone. Everyone has crashed. And all of a sudden, I'm sitting in this chair, and all of a sudden the door just explodes off the hinges, and all these state troopers rush in there with guns. He comes right up to me, and he puts his gun right in my nose, and he says, I dare you to move. And internally, I'm hearing the Lord saying, hey, I am the Lord, don't mess with me. Because I had said out loud, just before the door exploded, I was having these thoughts. And I was talking out loud to the Lord. And I said, Lord, I really want to serve you, but, I'm not strong enough to get away from. I had no idea at that time just how strong a hold drugs had on me. Mm-hmm. And so I'm speaking out loud to the Lord, and I'm telling him, Lord, I really want to serve you, but I don't know if I can do this. Just then, that's when the door exploded, and these guys come in, and it's they dragged us all out of the house. There must have been 9 or 10 people in the house, put us in the car, and they were bringing me back out to the place I had just left.
Right.
And then I started crying. I started crying because the whole humiliation of having to go out there and face the guys, all these guys that we had led to the Lord, and I was God's man of faith and power, the Jesus guy, and so they're dragging me out there, and I'm just broken now. What a humiliating and unbelievable experience. And so they took all 9 of us, the guys that were there, and put us in a cell. And right there, as soon as I got in there, I got down on my knees in front of all these guys, and I am crying out to the Lord, repenting, Lord, I'm so sorry. I am such a weak idiot, and I'm crying out to the Lord and just praying. And my best friend, who I had led to the Lord, made his way out to the holding cell where we were, stood at the bars, and I went up there, and he cursed at me and turned around and left. And I never saw him again. This was a moment for me. But I'm really repentant. And so the next day they come and they say, well, the charges against you have been dropped. Get out of the state. Don't come back. And so that was I take my Bible and my one change of clothes, go straight to the airport and come back home, and not knowing what I'm going to do with my life after that. But this was a really important moment for me, because it was like, in John chapter 21, there's this whole story about Peter, where Peter denies the Lord. And, hey, I'm out of here, I'm going fishing. And so he goes off and he's done. And Jesus is gone. But this was a defining moment for me, because I really would have been a yo-yo Christian. I would have been, going to church, doing a little drugs, until this moment. This issue had to be settled in my life once and for all. And that was a defining moment, because it settled the issue of drugs and lifestyle and all that once and for all. There was no way I was going back after this experience. Yeah. So it was a very important time for me.
I think it's a powerful example of how God uses adverse circumstances in our lives to settle issues like that, and to deal with things that people have left undealt with in their lives for so long. And, a lot of times we go through things like that, and it's like, why me? Why God? Why now? And, when you can look back on your life and you could see something like what you just described, I would have been in and out and in and out. I never would have fully committed. And God used that adverse circumstance. And what are the chances of you being in that home right when the state troopers come again? And,
well, they had followed me. They had followed me. It was like I was I just gotten out of jail.
Yeah, wherever you went.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. But that's great. It's great to see just how God used that kind of an experience to really settle that issue in your heart. So, you come back home and, you're trying to get settled and trying to build a foundation. How did you get your foundation built in your faith?
Well, I come back home. I go to my parents' house, which is the kingdom of chaos, really, and I'm only there for a week, and I'm looking for a job. So I'm going from Auburn into Seattle looking for work, and I'm going door to door. Hey, I'd like a job. I need a job. But I'm a convicted felon. It's not an easy thing. And so I'm standing on the street, and there's this young guy who's preaching on the streets. Hellfire and brimstone type preaching. And I'm leaning against the wall just watching this kid. He's about 17 years old. And watching. And he sees me watching him. So then he comes over, and he begins to talk to me. And, of course, in a few minutes, I'm telling him, I just got out of prison, I've accepted Jesus, blah, blah, blah. And he says, well, hey, why don't you come to our house for dinner? We got a Jesus People house up on Queen Anne Hill, and come to our house for dinner. And I said, okay, fine. So this step van comes around with about 20 Jesus People in it and picks us all up, brings me up to the Jesus People house. And they have a little worship, and they have a meal, and then they have some testimonies, and they have a little word. And the minute I walked in the door, I knew I was supposed to be there. And I absolutely knew it. And so I went to the leadership. I said, hey, I'd like to, join your group. And he says, well, do you smoke? I said, yes, I smoke. He said, well, you can do one of two things. You can either smoke or you can join us. Take your pick. So I said, okay, I'm done with that, which was not, I said it, but it wasn't easy. I managed to get through that. So I went, got my stuff from home and moved into the Jesus People house. I'm a little older than most of the kids who are in there. I'm now 24 years old. Most of them are like 17, 18, 19, all these street kids, and there's a few older people. But right from the get-go, I'm really in it, in the Jesus People movement. It was like a great environment for me at the time.
And for those who don't know, Jesus People movement was this real grassroots revival, really, that was going on in the 70s. Mostly in the West Coast is where it originated, but Richard has a lot of great stories from that experience, which was a significant movement. Hundreds of thousands of people came to Christ in that time, and there were all these communes and things getting started. It was kind of during those hippie love days, and but so many people were coming to Jesus. It was this really amazing kind of environment, and that's where really you got formed in your faith and became a leader in the church and so many things.
Within a year I was a leader in the house and teaching the Bible, and then we had a big outreach in the city of Tacoma at Wrights Park, and more than 2,000 people got saved, and in that 3-day outreach. And so then we baptized 450 of them in the water of Puget Sound, and then the leadership of the Jesus People decided that I should go. I'm just a baby Christian, that I should take a team, go to Tacoma. We rented 3 houses, and we started the Tacoma Jesus People group. At that time, there was a church called People's Church down in Tacoma that was really, on fire. A lot of young people, and so we kind of connected with them. But I started the Jesus People down there, and I started teaching Bible studies 5 nights a week at this place we rented down in Tacoma. We had our own coffee house, and so during those years, and I had a gift for teaching the Bible. It was just, that was rather obvious, but it was pretty simple at that time. Thompson Chain Reference Bible, topical teaching, teach what the Bible says, try your best to interpret what it means. And so, and we grew down there. And then what brought us back to Seattle after a couple of years was that there was a crisis with the children of God. And some of you may remember this was a big story. This cultic group came in to the city of Seattle and literally took over the Seattle Jesus People movement.
Okay, so it kind of infiltrated and then...
Yeah, and so they brought us up for a meeting with them, and I knew from the very moment I saw them that these people were way off. And so I resisted that whole thing. They wanted us to join that, and I said no, and had to go against my own leadership in order to refuse to do that. But that was a big moment for us. And after a few months, the Seattle Charismatic Pastors Fellowship got involved, and the Children of God couldn't get any foothold in the city of Seattle, so they all left. And so we moved back to Seattle, picked up some other people, and we had about 120 people in the Jesus movement at that point. And so we went on for a few years, going out in the streets, doing the Jesus People thing. And then the Lord really spoke to us about shutting it down and going to church.
Right.
And so, which is what we did.
Yeah. It's the movement started to kind of peter out a little bit, and sustainably, for Christian faith, church has always been the plan, as far as, how God brings people together and how community is formed and faith is built and all those kinds of things.
Right.
And so, so you get involved in a church in Seattle.
Right. I got involved in a church in North Seattle. And the reason we got involved there is because members of that church had been coming down to the Jesus People House with food, with curtains, with furniture, with all this stuff, really reaching out to us and loving us. And so we started going there. It was just in the early days of the charismatic renewal, and this church went from 400 people to 2,000 to 2,500 people in just a couple of years.
Yep.
And so I went to that church for a couple years, and then they decided to ask me to come on staff. I'm 3.5 years old in the Lord. I've had no formal Bible training, but they know me because we had a home group, and I had spoken a number of times on Sunday nights, and so they wanted me to come on staff as the young married pastor, which we did. And there's a lot of story behind that, but
So
that's how we got going.
Yeah, that's how you got started as a pastor. And I don't want to dive too deep into what happens as far as that goes. But the church is healthy. It's moving and shaking, and things are going great. And then there's kind of this shift. There's this unhealth in the leadership, especially at the top level. And then once again, kind of like with the children of God and the Jesus people, you have to kind of stand in resistance to some unhealthy things that are going on at the church.
Well, between 1970 and 1995, the church was really booming.
So it's a long period
so
of time.
Healthy.
Yeah.
Of course, then we wandered into the discipleship shepherding movement, and the senior leadership of the church became more and more authoritarian and it was all in the name of discipleship. And so gradually over time, and part of it was our pride. We were so proud, of who we were. We were, we had this idea that we were, the number one church in the city, and, but gradually we drifted in the wrong direction. And at the end of that, a group of us had to stand up and resist the leadership of the church. We call that period the church wars. Took a great toll. I mean, it was a devastating time for all of us. And so I had to go through 12 steps twice, after that experience. It was a devastating time. I would have quit the ministry altogether, but I knew the Lord wouldn't let me. And
so, you had a number of experiences. Obviously the Foursquare Church when you were young had some unhealth in it. You had these setbacks, after prison. You had some negative experiences with the Jesus people. You had this now church experience. What was it about? Because I think one of the things that really defines your faith journey is perseverance and pushing on in the midst of setbacks, disappointments, devastating situations. What is it about that experience that you just recognize? Hey, here's how you get through a situation like that?
Well, even from the beginning, when I had to make the decision to become a Christian, and knowing so many Christians that were distasteful, and I didn't want to be one of those, and I had to decide whether or not I was going to let other people's behavior dictate my relationship with the Lord. And this always kind of mystifies me, how people can throw the Lord over because some of his disciples behave badly. And so from the very beginning, Valerie and I both, we were people who prayed. We were people who had our own faith. We had our own walk with the Lord. And, the setbacks in life, a lot of people, for some reason, they just quit because somebody says something or does something, or they've been disappointed by leadership, and you gotta deal with this early on in your life. Because our relationship with the Lord is separate from that, and yet it is it's vital that we're part of a community. But by the same time, if you have a disappointment with the community, you move on. You don't quit in your walk with the Lord. And so early on, that first decision of me deciding to go all out for Jesus in spite of who's a hypocrite and who's not a hypocrite was a very important issue in my life. That set me up to go on when the Jesus People movement went sideways, when the church went sideways, you move on. And you don't quite exactly know how that's going to go. You just got to hear from God. And learning to hear from God is really a vital and important thing. One time I sat down and I wrote on a piece of paper some of my steps of faith, Valerie and I's steps of faith. And I thought maybe there would just be a few of them, but when I was done, I had written on both sides of a lined sheet of paper like 75 steps of faith that Valerie and I took in our life. And, steps, times when we didn't know what we were going to do, we just had to hear from God and take a step of faith. And some of those steps of faith, even starting what we're doing in Kenya, was a huge step of faith.
Right.
And so some of those steps of faith were really stepping out on the water. I mean, you just didn't know. You stepped out in faith, not having the resources, not having, you had to take a step of faith and let the Lord do the rest. But those were important moments in our life.
Yeah,
Starting Westside was another huge step of faith.
Right. One of the things that we've coined a phrase around here, we want Jesus to be the loudest voice in your life. And I think a lot of that comes from the lesson that you just described, because, in so many people's walk with Jesus, like you said, it's the example of another person or maybe the failure of a leader who was over them that causes them to throw in the towel. And it's so critically important that you have that connection with Jesus, that relationship with Jesus. I always think of that experience of Moses and the children of Israel at the mountain, and the people reject direct connection with God, and they say, we want Moses to go in between, which is a wonderful example of Moses' leadership and how he was the go-between. But it was never God's desire for that to exist. God wants a relationship with us directly. And oftentimes, the negative side effect of kind of having another person who's a representative of God for you, at least to the degree that it can be unhealthy, is that their failure, it causes you to go into a tailspin. And it's so really important, critically important, that we have a personal connection, a relationship with Jesus. And I think that is a testimony to, how you have navigated so many of those negative experiences in your life. And as well, what you're saying, these faith steps, really cause you to depend on Christ and your relationship with God above and beyond, what you could rely on other people for. And so developing that faith, developing that trust in God through that journey has been critical. But, I know, and we don't have a lot of time left, but I know that, from there, God used you to plant a church out of that previous church, which has been Westside. And of course, since then, 10 years after that, launching World Comp, which is now this amazing nonprofit ministry in Kenya, and walking with Jesus all along that way. What for you has been? What for you have been some of these other faith lessons? I mean, as far as these faith steps that you've taken, what are some things that stand out to you as far as lessons learned along the way in those two endeavors?
Well, I'm not an impulse guy. And so whenever the Lord speaks to me, there's always this period between what he says and the implementation, because, I need confirmation. And if I'm going to really be a part of something, I need confirmation. And so I always, the Lord often has spoken to me about doing things, and my normal response is no. I mean, it's not no, it's just reluctance. And I'm always wanting, to make sure that, you sit down, you count the costs, whether or not you have enough to do what God is telling you to do. And
so what was your confirmation moment for starting Westside Church?
Oh, we had a lot of confirmations.
That's true.
Yeah, there was a whole string of confirmations about starting Westside Church. First of all, it was kind of impulsive, because I'm driving down 15th Avenue, and I'm seeing, at that time, the condition of Ballard was unbelievably bad.
Yeah, it was Lutefisk town. Yeah.
Oh, and it was in decline. It was really going downhill. There were none of the apartments, and it wasn't what it is today.
Yeah.
And it was really a rundown place. There was no significant church in this area. I'm driving down 15th on my way to somewhere, and the Lord spoke to me about starting a work here. Now, there was a little history to that, because at that time I had already brought Don Ross into taking over
The previous church.
the previous church. And I had stepped down, and I was his associate, and we were happy. I mean, I was relatively well paid. Life was good. I no longer was in the captain's chair. It was like, this was a really good time. But I'm driving down 15th, and the Lord speaks to me about starting a work in Ballard. And immediately I went home and told Valerie, and she said, no way. I'm not doing that. Absolute no. And so all I could say to her at that point was, hey, just pray about it. But all of a sudden after that, we had one confirmation after another. And some confirmations are just small things, people saying things, or and we had a whole lot of confirmations. I went to Don Ross. I talked to him about, hey, I think I need to go out and start a work. And he immediately was very excited about that. It would kind of take me back. It's like, oh, you want to get rid of me? It's like, but he was in a transition because he was trying to gain the loyalty of the people of the church who were mostly loyal to me. Mm-hmm. And so it was, we'd been in the transition 4 years, and I really understood this is what's supposed to happen. Yeah. So we got a number of confirmations, and then we started having prayer meetings, and all of the indicators were green lights. And so green lights are important things, because sometimes you can have an idea, it's not a God idea, and you can set yourself up for failure by doing what you think God is telling you without proper confirmation. So
right.
And that applies to everything in life, buying houses, whatever. People do things on impulse. People move from Seattle to Stanwood. They have all this, these great ideas about how peaceful that's going to be, and then you end up isolated and divorced.
Right. Yeah, prayerfully moving through these important stages in life is a critical thing. And I mean, and I think it's undeniable how God has used the church. And I think, as well, it's this beautiful story into how World Compass started, because, the church is moving, and that's kind of your number one. God starts to impress upon me to take leadership over in the church. And it's already this movement that's going on, or this work that's starting in Kenya through a relationship with Osborne that's been years and years in the making. But one of the things that I really felt like God was asking us to do was put all of our effort, all of our missions focus on Kenya. And then me taking over leadership of the church was this opportunity for you to take more seriously what was happening in Kenya and to turn it into a full-fledged nonprofit ministry that is doing so many things throughout the year. But
yeah, if you look at where we were when you first took over the church and where we are now, I mean, World Comp is
exponential growth.
Oh,
yeah.
It's gigantic, and you can look toward the future and see, if you keep going the direction you're going to end up where you're going. And so we're still growing and developing, and it's a very significant and impactful work.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I want to thank it on behalf of everybody who's listening, and so many people have been under your leadership, have been mentored by you, have been pastored by you over the years, and I want to honor you for just faithfully following God. Your story is incredible. Your legacy is incredible. So many people so appreciate it, and it's good to be able to sit down and just kind of talk about the whole story from beginning to it's still going, but it's good to sit down and just contemplate all the things that God has done in your life. There's a lot of gratitude I feel towards you and your journey with Christ and following in Christ in faith and expression of faith, and you've been a wonderful role model, and it's amazing to see the work that God has done in your life. And so thank you. Thank you for that.
Well, you're most welcome.
And thank you for sharing your story with all of us as well.
Let me just say one last thing to those of you who are watching this. I think one of the most critical things is for us to be willing to say yes to the Lord. And it surprises me how many people have fallen into the patterns of saying no to the Lord because it's an inconvenience, a step of faith. It requires stepping out of your comfort zone, especially the big one. But saying yes to the Lord, way back when, there was a guy named Harold Bredesen who was kind of a goofy guy. He wrote a book called Yes, Lord. And he describes his own experience with the Lord simply in the terms of, I just said yes. And this guy was not he wasn't the sharpest tool in the shed, but God used him in such an unbelievable way just because he said, yes, Lord. And I just want to encourage those of you who are here, say yes, Lord. I mean, determine in your own heart, that when the Lord speaks to you. Today, if you hear his voice, don't harden your heart. Go with him. And your life's going to be a great adventure just because you're saying yes.
Yeah, well, that's a great way to summarize your life and adventure in faith with Jesus. So thanks for that parting wisdom. Well, thanks everybody for tuning in and joining with us. We're going to continue this series next week with another faith story before we launch into Advent. But so good to be able to hear Richard's story this morning. And thank you, Richard, for sharing with us. God bless everybody. Have a great week, and we will see you next time.